Okay, so Mr. Brookes, thank you so much for joining me for this week's Must Talks. We are going to talk today about the security dynamic in the Russian-Ukrainian war, but also the security dynamic in the Middle East. But before that, since we are still at the beginning of the year, I would say, I would like to start by asking you, what do you think are the main security challenges in 2024? And please tell me if you think that we are witnessing a global order change, as some people say here and there.
Okay, that's a lot. That's a lot of questions here. So I think for this year, I believe that there's going to be four main issues with perhaps a fifth one. And of course, there's many you cannot predict, right? So but for what I see right now in front of me, when I look at the international landscape, is that we're going to obviously have Russia, Ukraine, as you mentioned. This will be a very big issue. There's concerns about the Taiwan Strait and China and Taiwan. I'm worried about North Korea. A lot of their actions or their belligerence. And we can talk a little bit more about each one of these if you'd like. And then, of course, I'm worried about Iran. And of course, its effect on the Middle East. And I'm a little bit more worried about the rise of militant groups, including violent extremist organizations. We saw what Hamas did in Israel last year. We saw what happened just last week, almost a week ago, in Jordan, when militant groups in Iraq, backed by Iran, attacked U.S. forces in Jordan. So I'm a little bit worried about the rise of that and the effects. I'm worried about a return of ISIS, for instance. I'm worried about Afghanistan, that same sort of thing that we worried about for many years. I'm worried about some of those things as well now, but to a lesser extent, those four are the main ones that I'm really focusing on.
So when it comes to a possible change of the global order, what do you think about that?
Well, the world is very dynamic. It's a very dynamic place. We are often surprised by events. I mean, there was going back to World War II, there was Pearl Harbor. I mean, of course, there was Germany's actions in Europe during World War II. It was the Korean War, the Vietnam War, there were wars in the Middle East, 9/11. So there's always, the world is very dynamic. We have a famous American writer that you may have heard of called Mark Twain. And one of my favorite quotes of his, and he has very many, is that he says that history does not repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. So we don't see exact repeating of issues, but we see things that happen that seem similar to things that have happened in the past. So this is something of concern here. Yes, there are some dynamics in the world that we should be concerned about. The rise of China, for instance, is something that's been going on for quite some time now, 25 or 30 years, but it continues to move in a direction of concern to some people, including myself. Russia is back. The idea that Russia was going to join the Western liberal group of democracies after the end of the Cold War is not going to happen. Russia is a revisionist country now, and we see what it's doing. We see what it's doing in Ukraine. So that's very troubling. I think we have a multipolar world. We do, and we see the rise of these powers that I mentioned that can cause a significant amount of trouble, such as North Korea. Where it's located in that part of Northeast Asia. I mean, we have some of the world's largest economies. We have China, we have Japan, we have South Korea, we have Taiwan. And they could at any time cause some problems or a crisis that would affect the entire globe. We're so interconnected now. I think Russia and China would like to replace the United States as the preeminent power in the world. I think China has the potential to do that. Russia, I don't think has that potential, but it's happy to diminish U.S. power by working with China. I think that China will be attractive in some ways to people, perhaps economically, perhaps attractive to countries that wish to be authoritarian as well as rich. But I don't think their soft power is going to attract people in the same way that the American and Western powers have attracted people around the world. So yeah, I wouldn't say the order has changed, but it does shift. It never stays the same. Think about, for instance, Andrea, if Iran becomes a nuclear weapons state, would that be a significant shift? Yeah. You know, especially all the things that Iran is involved with in the region, you know, that would be a significant shift. So something like that could, you know, certainly could happen this year. But I wouldn't say the order has changed significantly. We see the same powers generally, same major power centers, you know, such as the United States and such as Europe, Russia, China. India is a country I didn't mention, but someplace else, also the global South, such as Brazil, South Africa, some of these BRICS countries. But I wouldn't say the order has fundamentally changed, but I do believe there are some powers, especially China and some of the BRICS, that would like to change the post-World War II international order.
You said Russia lost its power to actually take the US's role. Do you think it lost it after the war in Ukraine, or it didn't have the power at all?
See, the thing is about Russia never really became a great economic power. It wasn't one during the Soviet days. It was a military power and a political power. Afterwards, it I think passed up on the opportunity to become a great economic power, other than its energy exports. But in terms of industry, things like that, I mean, Russia fundamentally relies on its energy exports, arms sales, nuclear power exports, nuclear power plant exports, things like that, but it hasn't fundamentally become an economic power. So in the same way that China has. Now, Russia is a military power. There's no question about that. Perhaps not as powerful as people thought before the Ukraine war. And of course, it's a political power. You know, it sits on the UN Security Council, has veto rights there. Plays a role in major international organizations, has a large population, although there are demographic challenges. So I don't think that at this point that Russia has the capacity to replace the United States as the preeminent power. China might, and that's certainly one of its goals. Like I said, I'm not sure if people will be as attracted to Chinese ways of doing business, Chinese ways of diplomacy, as they have with the United States. Not that everybody's completely happy, obviously, but I think I'm not sure that it has the same sort of soft power attraction that the United States and the West developed after World War II.
Now, going to Ukraine and what's happening in Ukraine after the Russian invasion, what do you think 2024 will bring for this country from a military and security perspective?
Yeah, another quote I like very much is that of the Danish physicist Niels Bohr, who said that prediction is hard, especially if it's about the future. So very hard to say. If I had to give you an answer, my sense is that there will be challenges for Ukraine to sustain Western support. I think that the Russians are pleased by that. Ukraine does need Western support, and I am personally supportive of continuing that military support to Ukraine. I sense that negotiations are probably not likely. I think the parties are very far apart. I'm afraid there's a lot more tragedy and unhappiness in this year for that theater. I think that President Putin is committed to achieving what he wants to achieve in Ukraine, both for purposes of legacy, such as being put aside besides other great or celebrated Russian and Soviet leaders. And I think Ukraine is part of that. And I think it's nationalism as well. But this is causing a lot of pain in Russia as well. There's no question about it. Economically, it's hurting them, obviously, from a humanitarian standpoint, military standpoint. There's a lot of things that are, obviously painful to Russia, but Putin doesn't really seem to care at this point. My sense, if I had to once again give you a projection, is that it'll become largely a defensive war of attrition this year. That I think that Russia has accomplished a lot of what it wanted. I mean, it wanted Kiev, and it was stopped. But I think it also it's created a land bridge between Crimea and Russia now, along the coast there, along the Black Sea coast. I think in turn Russia will go into a defensive position there in the Donbass and along the Black Sea coast to preserve that. And as military strategists will tell you, it takes a lot more people on offense to overcome defense. Sometimes they say 6 to 1 soldiers for every one on defense, 6 on offense to 1 on defense. Some say 10. And the Russians, as we know, during the counteroffensive, put in a lot of defensive obstacles to Ukraine, and it can be difficult to overcome that. Now, once again, Ukraine may be receiving some more air power this year. I think people are very impressed at their bravery and courage and their innovation. Drones are shaping the war significantly. I mean, it's a very interesting thing. More Western equipment is coming to Ukraine. Troops are being trained. But I sense it's going to be a defensive battle this year. Of course, weather will play a role, right? It's winter now. It's very cold. And of course, but the ground is hard, so it allows armor to move around quite well. The spring will make things much softer, much more difficult for armor. So we'll have to see, but that's my sense for the moment. I would certainly like to see this war end and Russian troops return to Russia and Ukraine's territorial integrity and political sovereignty be restored to all of the regions, including Crimea, which I think was taken illegally as well.
Before air power gets to Ukraine, we see that Kiev is struggling with getting ammunition. We saw that yesterday the European Union approved the package for Ukraine, which is good news, of course, but we still don't know if the financial aid from the US will actually get to Ukraine. What do you think about that?
I think it will. You know, we have a lot of politics going on here in Washington. We have both congressional elections this year and a presidential election. So there's a lot of political posturing going on, and I was a Capitol Hill staffer, so I understand this very well, how this works. I think ultimately they will. There's also a lot of pressure financially, because although the American economy seems to be recovering, we also have the issue with Israel. So there's aid packages for both, and you know as we say in the United States, the pie is only so big. And so these are both important issues to us. And then there's other potential challenges. As you know, the United States has shifted a lot of its focus to the Pacific. And that has nothing to do with the Middle East, you know, essentially, or what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. I'm not saying they're completely divorced from that, but I mean, that's a whole nother theater of war. And I mentioned North Korea. So there are challenges, but I think, and I personally support, not that that means much, but I personally support military support for Ukraine going forward. And it's good what the EU has done so far. I mean, my concern is that if Russia is successful in Ukraine, another American phrase, that its appetite will grow with the eating. That the more it eats, the more it will become hungry, and that this could be a problem for NATO.
Now we have presidential elections in the US, as you said, but
Right.
Russia also has presidential elections this year. Even if some say that these are not actual presidential elections because we know who's going to win, right?
Right.
What do you think about these presidential elections? Do you think they will somehow affect or influence what's happening on the battlefield in Ukraine?
Well, I think you're right. I think Putin will be reelected. But I think that there are many people who are discontented with Russia's involvement in Ukraine. We hear stories about Russian women being very unhappy about their sons and their brothers and their husbands and their boyfriends being sent to fight in Ukraine for reasons they don't understand. So I think that while Putin will control the political landscape for this election and for going forward, I think that we will see people raise their voices during the campaign. Now, I think Russian security forces will address that, but I think people will speak up. And I think the more people that speak up, the more potential effect it will have on the Kremlin. Now, I would say that I believe that even authoritarian governments, have to worry about public opinion, right? For instance, we saw what happened in Eastern Europe after the wall started to fall, including in your own country. So public opinion is, leaders have control, but they don't have tremendous control. The Chinese are scared to death of another Tiananmen Square, which almost toppled the government. Putin doesn't like color revolutions. So, I mean, Putin has to pay attention to these things. And I think he will, and there will be adjustments that will be, that will probably be made to try to quiet the public. But I expect that many Russians who are unhappy with the situation in Russia will speak up, or at least speak among themselves, which the Kremlin will get wind of about their dissatisfaction with this thing. But I don't think it's going to change the course of the war. Once again, I believe that Putin is driven by his legacy and by nationalism. And also the war in Ukraine can also distract from problems at home. So people aren't thinking about their economic situation or otherwise.
In the second year of war in Ukraine, Russia started to get a lot of help, let's say, in terms of weapons from Iran, North Korea, and some say even China. What do you think? Why do you think these countries are helping Russia? What's beside all these theater, let's say?
Yeah, there's not one answer. Each country has its interests. Let's start with Iran. Iran, and remember, any of these countries that send weapons benefit from any feedback they get on their capabilities. So if they find out that, if North Korea finds out that its missiles aren't working in war, I mean, you can test and test and test, but you don't really know. It's like with sports, you can practice and practice and practice, but until you get out on the playing field, you don't know how good you are. So these weapons and testing of weapons is done in a controlled environment. So all of these countries will receive feedback on their weapons. Did North Korean weapons work? Are they working in battle? In real difficult conditions, such as the cold of the winter in Central Europe. Are Iranian drones working? Can they be better? I think also that in the same way, I think that the Russians have probably supplied captured Western armaments to these countries. I know China would be very interested in having access to that. I don't know that has happened, but I just assume it has happened. There's been reports about it happening with Iran in the news. Maybe even North Korea. These are all potential adversaries of the United States, and I'm sure the Chinese would be very, very interested. So that's one element of it. They want to see how their stuff works. They want feedback on it. They also, a lot of these countries are pariahs and isolated, and they're looking for friends. Obviously, Russia, and of course, Russia can also sell them. Russia makes some very capable military systems, especially their air defenses. So Iran would like, probably to have access to more advanced weaponry. And there's rumors that they might receive advanced Russian fighter jets. North Korea wants money. They also want a big friend in Russia. And that relationship I just wrote a paper on that not too long ago. for GIS, Global Geopolitical Intelligence Services, where they have some common interests, and then they have some individual unilateral interests that can be supported by the other partner. North Korea would like Russia to be a friend of theirs, to support them in UN Security Council, also to help them with their military programs. Like, think about Iran, for instance. It's believed that Russia may have helped Iran overcome its difficulties with launching satellites after they started supplying weapons or drones to Russia. North Korea is also interested in advanced weaponry, or perhaps technical help with those sort of things. So there's a lot of reasons for these groups to, especially since they tend to be isolated politically because of some of their actions. Well, maybe less so China, but Russia certainly is, Iran certainly is, and so is North Korea. So there's lots of reasons for these people to cooperate with one another. Russia can get arms, the others can get technical and military support, political support, those sort of things.
Now going to the Middle East, how would you describe the security dynamic in the region, considering the Israel-Hamas war, what's happening in the Red Sea with Houthi members launching attacks towards commercial ships and so on? Also the attacks in Jordan a few days ago.
Yeah. How long do you have? It's a very complex question, obviously. One way I describe it is that it's kind of like a three-dimensional chessboard, where you're not just playing in one dimension, you're playing on a couple of different dimensions. There are a lot of things at hand. I was explaining in a television interview this morning to the anchor, I said, think about the United States strike on these militant groups in retribution for the attack on U.S. forces in Jordan. They're going to go after people who are probably Iraqi citizens in Iraq, backed by Iran, probably have Iranian advisors there, although I think the Iranians have probably left. It's just very complicated. You think about it, that involves Iran. That also involves Iraq, which is still a partner of the United States, and we have 2,500 forces in Iraq. They may not like the idea of us attacking Iraqi territory. It affects the relations with Iran, who is involved in a nuclear program and is supporting the Houthis in Yemen, supports Hamas, supports Hezbollah in Lebanon, has a very capable IRGC, has shown belligerence in the Persian Gulf, is a major oil producer. So this is very complicated stuff. There's also another thing that I remind people of is that while we're doing this, there's also hostage negotiations going on between Hamas and Israel. And obviously Hamas, which a lot of people think is an odd partnership with Iran, because as we know in the Middle East, Sunni Shia means something. And Hamas is a Sunni organization. Iran is Shia. So we see, the relationship with, the Shia in Iraq, the militia groups we see with Shia, Hezbollah in Lebanon. But then you have this other group here that is not. But Iran will use people who will advance their agenda as necessary. And I'm not sure that Iran really cares about those proxies, as long as it advances Iran's agenda. So there's a lot of things going on here, at once. So yeah, you talk about the increased shipping costs around the world because of ships not being able to go through the Red Sea and having to go around the Horn of Africa. So there's a lot of issues involved with this. Like I said, it's very, very complex. And it's understandable why the United States is taking a little bit of time to decide how to respond.
You mentioned Iran, and we know it's a major actor in the region. Do we have any concerns? Should we have any concerns about Iran's nuclear capabilities in this context?
Well, I'm not sure who when we say we, I'm not sure who you're referring to. Whether you're, excuse me.
We, the world.
The world, yes, I think so, and I certainly do. One of the reasons I worry about Iran having a nuclear weapon is that, and I believe they are trying to move in that direction, is that it would give them significant freedom of action. In other words, we can easily show the case of how the United States and NATO was cautious about responding to Russia in Ukraine because of Russia's nuclear capabilities, whether at the strategic level or at the tactical nuclear level. So that certainly will give you pause. North Korea developed its nuclear weapons capability probably for deterrence purposes, to deter the United States, to deter South Korea. Also, you know, it has a lot of very powerful countries around it as well. Iran, I think, has great power ambitions. You know, the Persian Empire was a large empire at one time. I think that this regime is revisionist, would like to change that. It has tremendous rivalries in the Middle East. I often say that Iran is a Shia Persian country in a Sunni Arab neighborhood. And of course, all of Iran is not Persian, but I mean, there are other large ethnic groups as well. You know, the Kurds, the Baloch, and others. But you know, I think it wants to be it has an issue about and its rivalry between Shiism and Sunnism in the Middle East. It's you know, so and I think it would like to be the most powerful country in the Middle East and the most influential in the Muslim world widely. So, and plus their state sponsorship of terrorism, which the United States says is the most active in the world. There's no country in the world that supports terrorism, terror groups more than Iran. So could Iran get away with more if it had a nuclear weapon and the world had to think about whether it could push back on Iran because it had this most powerful weapon known to man? That's kind of troubling, considering the things that Iran has done in the past, is currently doing, and perhaps would do in the future. Now, Iran has the largest missile arsenal in the Middle East. Covers all of the Middle East. If you were Israel, you would be very concerned about Iran with a nuclear weapon, because it's an existential threat. To an American audience, I can say Israel's about the size of New Jersey, and they would understand, but to an international audience, I'm not sure. But, you know, Israel is not a large country. It wouldn't take much in terms of nuclear weapons to attack it and have tremendous devastation. So they're concerned about that. And the United States is also concerned because Iran is developing a space program, and there's very little difference between the capability to put a satellite in space and put a warhead anywhere on the Earth's surface. So if Iran is able to develop a very capable space program, see, this is what a lot of people don't understand, is back in 1957, when Sputnik went into space for the Russians, a lot of people said, oh my goodness, they're beating us in the space race. But the real thing is that they were actually beating us in the ICBM race, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile race, because once you can put a satellite into orbit, you can put a nuclear warhead anywhere on the Earth's planet. I mean, it's not that simple, but for simple purposes, that's what's going on. And a lot of people say that Iran is developing its space program for the purposes of developing an ICBM program that could threaten the United States and Europe. Right now, their missiles can hit parts of southeastern Europe, so that might be Romania. I don't know that they have an issue with Romania, but that could expand much further into Europe. Certainly, the missiles can go the other way. Iran just recently attacked some militants or they claim, in Pakistan, which is also a nuclear weapon state. So there's a lot of concerns about an increase in the number of countries with nuclear weapons, and including especially Iran and North Korea.
Okay, Thank you so much. These were my questions for today.
Okay, all right.